Off the storm-battered coast, where maps showed only empty water, Elena thought she had found her escape. The 17-year-old had fled the state orphanage with nothing but stolen hope and a faded chart, rowing through the night in an abandoned boat until her hands bled. When the forgotten island emerged from the fog, she believed it would be her sanctuary, a place to disappear and survive alone. But as she dragged herself onto the rocky shore, exhaustion gave way to shock. Fresh smoke curled from a hidden cove, a warm lantern glowed in a structure half buried in vines, and wet footprints led from a weathered dock into the dense interior. Someone lived here, on an island that existed on no modern map, in a place the world had abandoned. Who hides on forgotten land? What secret could be worth such isolation? And could the orphan, who had never known family, find exactly what she needed in the last place she expected? The room where they took Elena on her 17th birthday was not the usual holding cell with its gray walls and single bare bulb. It was Director Margaret Voss's private office, a detail that sent a cold spike of dread through her chest. The office was a study in contrasts, polished mahogany furniture that gleamed under soft lamplight, thick carpets that muffled sound, and walls lined with leather-bound books that had never been read. It was a place designed to project authority and respectability, a facade the director wore as skillfully as her tailored suits and her practiced smile. But Elena knew the truth that lurked behind the pleasant mask. She had been at Riverside State Orphanage since she was 6 years old, long enough to understand that Director Voss's cruelty was not born of stress or overwork, but of something darker, something that took genuine pleasure in breaking the spirits of children who had nowhere else to go. The infraction that had earned Elena this visit was minor, almost laughable. She had been caught reading after lights out, a battered paperback novel she had found in the donation bin. But minor infractions were simply excuses, and Elena had learned long ago that the punishment was never really about the crime. As Director Voss struck her with the wooden ruler she kept in her desk drawer, each blow precise and measured to leave pain but not visible marks, Elena's eyes wandered desperately around the room, seeking anything to focus on besides the searing sting across her shoulders and the hot tears she refused to let fall. It was during one of these frantic visual escapes that she saw it, the corner of an old map, its edges yellowed and brittle with age, protruding from a half-open drawer in the antique filing cabinet behind the director's desk. The map was beautiful in its antiquity, hand-drawn with the careful precision of another era, showing a coastline Elena recognized from the geography books in the orphanage's meager library. But there, marked in faded ink just off the shore, was a small island rendered in exquisite detail, complete with topographical lines and what looked like the outline of structures. She had never seen it on any modern map, and the strangeness of it burned itself into her mind, a small flame of curiosity that gave her something to hold on to as the ruler continued its work. When Director Voss finally dismissed her with a warning that next time the consequences would be far worse, Elena stumbled back to the dormitory she shared with 11 other girls, her back throbbing, her mind racing. That night, as the others slept in the restless, fearful way that children in such places always sleep, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She crept through the dark hallways with the practiced silence of someone who had spent years avoiding notice, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire building. The director's office lock was old and simple, and Elena had watched the janitor open it 100 times. Inside, she moved swiftly to the filing cabinet, pulled open the drawer, and took the map, folding it carefully and tucking it into the waistband of her jeans. She also grabbed a handful of cash from the petty cash box and a heavy wool coat that hung on the back of the door. Then she walked out of Riverside State Orphanage for the last time, moving through the front door as the ancient clock in the hallway struck midnight, and ran toward the distant sound of the ocean, toward freedom, toward a future she could not yet imagine, with nothing but stolen hope and a map to a place that should not exist. The walk through the darkness was a test of endurance Elena had not anticipated. She had run from the orphanage with nothing but adrenaline and desperation fueling her. But as the hours stretched on and the paved roads gave way to gravel paths and then to barely visible trails through scrub grass, her body began to protest in ways she could not ignore. Her feet, clad only in the thin canvas sneakers the orphanage provided, throbbed with each step. The stolen coat was too large and kept slipping from her shoulders, forcing her to clutch it closed with one hand while the other gripped the precious map. The night air off the ocean was bitter and damp, cutting through her worn jeans and thin shirt, and her lungs burned with the effort of breathing the salt-laden wind. But she did not stop, could not stop, because stopping meant thinking about what she had done, about the point of no return she had crossed, and thinking led to fear, and fear led to paralysis. So she walked, following the distant rhythmic crash of waves against shore, a sound that grew steadily louder as the miles fell away behind her. As the sky began to shift from black to a deep, bruised purple, the first hint of dawn approaching, the landscape around her changed dramatically. The scrubby hills gave way to a stretch of desolate coastline that looked like it had been abandoned by time itself. Scattered along the rocky shore were the skeletal remains of old fishing shacks, their walls collapsed inward, their roofs caved in or missing entirely, victims of decades of storms and neglect. The structures were dark and silent, monuments to a fishing industry that had moved on or died out, and they filled Elena with a profound sense of loneliness that matched the ache in her chest. She picked her way carefully through the ruins, her exhausted mind barely registering the details, until she pushed open the sagging door of one particular shack and stopped dead in her tracks. There, resting on the dirt floor, as if waiting specifically for her, was a small wooden rowboat. It was old, its paint faded to a pale ghost of what might once have been blue, its wood weathered to a silvery gray by years of sun and salt. But as Elena approached it with trembling hands and examined it in the growing light, she realized with a surge of hope so intense it made her dizzy that the boat was sound. The planks were tight, the hull showed no signs of rot, and though there was only a single oar leaning against its side instead of the proper pair, it was clearly seaworthy. She took it as a sign, a gift from a universe that had given her so little, and with strength born of pure determination, she dragged the boat across the rocky beach, the wood scraping and bumping over stones, her muscles screaming in protest. By the time she reached the water's edge, the sun was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gold and pink that were almost painfully beautiful. Elena spread the stolen map across the boat's bench seat, her hands shaking as she oriented herself using the coastline features she could see. The island marked on the antique chart was out there somewhere, beyond the visible horizon, a destination that existed only on faith and faded ink. She pushed the boat into the surf, the cold water shocking against her legs, and climbed in. She gripped the single oar with both hands, positioned it awkwardly in the crude oarlock, and began to row. The motion was unfamiliar and inefficient, each stroke uneven and weak, but she persisted, pulling against the resistance of the water with everything she had. Within minutes, her palms began to burn, the soft skin unused to such rough work blistering and tearing, but Elena did not stop. She rowed into the rising sun, into the unknown, each painful stroke carrying her farther from the only life she had ever known, and closer to a future she could only pray would be better than her past. The hours that followed became a blur of pain and exhaustion that pushed Elena to the very edge of her endurance. Her hands, already blistered and raw, had begun to bleed, the oar slick with a mixture of salt water and her own blood. Her shoulders burned with a fire that seemed to spread down her spine and into her lower back, and her arms trembled with each stroke, the muscles screaming for rest she could not afford to give them. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on her with relentless intensity, and she realized with growing panic that she had brought no water, no food, nothing but the map and the clothes on her back. Dehydration made her thoughts sluggish and confused, and more than once she found herself rowing in a slow circle, having lost her sense of direction on the featureless expanse of ocean. The map, her only guide, offered coordinates and landmarks but no sense of actual distance, and she had no way of knowing if she had been rowing for miles or if the island was still impossibly far away. Just when she thought she could not pull the oar one more time, when her vision had begun to blur and darken at the edges and despair was wrapping its cold fingers around her heart, the world changed. A fog bank rolled in from nowhere, a wall of thick gray mist that swallowed the sun and the sky and the horizon in a matter of seconds. It was so dense that Elena could barely see the bow of her own boat, the weathered wood disappearing into the swirling gray void. The temperature dropped dramatically, the moisture in the air clinging to her skin and hair, and the silence that descended was absolute and suffocating. She stopped rowing, too exhausted and disoriented to continue, and simply sat in the boat as it drifted, rising and falling on swells she could feel but not see. This was it, she thought with a strange, calm detachment. She had escaped the orphanage only to die alone on the ocean, swallowed by fog, her body destined to drift until the boat eventually sank, or she succumbed to thirst and exposure. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to part. It did not dissipate gradually, but rather pulled back like a curtain being drawn aside, and what it revealed stole what little breath Elena had left in her lungs. Rising from the water directly ahead, close enough that she could have reached it with another few minutes of rowing, was an island. It was exactly as the map had depicted it, a rocky formation crowned with dense, dark forest, its cliffs rising steeply from the water on the seaward side but gentling to a more accessible shore on the side that faced her. The island was wild and beautiful, untouched by the modern world, a place that seemed to exist outside of time. But as Elena's exhausted mind struggled to process what she was seeing, she noticed details that sent a new kind of shock through her system. There, jutting out from a sheltered cove on the near shore, was a wooden dock, and it was not ancient or rotting but sturdy and well-maintained, with fresh planks that stood out lighter against the weathered gray of the older wood. Rising from somewhere deep in the island's interior, barely visible above the canopy of trees, was a thin tendril of smoke, the unmistakable sign of a fire. And there, filtering through the dense foliage, was the warm, golden glow of lamplight, steady and welcoming. Elena stared in disbelief, her blistered hands frozen on the oar. The island she had sought as a refuge, a deserted sanctuary where she could hide and survive alone, was already occupied. Someone lived here, in this forgotten place that existed on no modern chart, hidden from the world. Her sanctuary was not empty, and she had no idea if that meant salvation or a danger even greater than the one she had fled. Elena's arms had no strength left to guide the boat properly, so she let the gentle waves push it toward the shore of the sheltered cove, the hull scraping against smooth stones with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the profound quiet. When the boat finally came to rest in the shallows, she tried to stand, but her legs, cramped from hours of sitting in the same position, buckled beneath her. She fell forward onto her hands and knees in the cold water, gasping at the shock of it, and for a long moment she simply stayed there, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief, and a fear she had not yet allowed herself to fully feel. Eventually, through sheer force of will, she crawled out of the water and onto the rocky beach, dragging herself beyond the tide line before collapsing onto her back, staring up at the canopy of trees that swayed gently overhead. The solid ground beneath her felt like the most luxurious bed she had ever known, and despite the danger, despite the unknown presence on the island, her body demanded rest. She must have drifted into unconsciousness for a few minutes because when she opened her eyes again, the light had shifted slightly and her clothes were beginning to dry in the cool air. Forcing herself to move, she sat up and looked around properly for the first time. The cove was beautiful, a perfect crescent of dark stones sheltered by rocky outcroppings on either side, and leading away from it into the forest was a path. It was not an animal trail but a deliberately maintained footpath, its edges cleared of brush, its surface packed down by years of regular use. Elena's heart hammered in her chest as she stood on unsteady legs and began to follow it, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, to get in the boat and row away. But curiosity and exhaustion drove her forward. The path wound through the dense forest, climbing gently upward, and as she walked, Elena began to notice the careful way the landscape had been shaped. Trees had been selectively thinned to allow light through without creating obvious clearings, and the underbrush had been managed to create natural screens. Then, as she rounded a bend, she saw them, a cluster of structures built so cleverly into the hillside that they were almost invisible, their roofs covered in living sod and moss, their walls the same weathered gray as the surrounding rocks. They looked like they had grown from the island itself, organic and ancient, and only the presence of windows with actual glass and the thin wisp of smoke from a stone chimney revealed them as human dwellings. Elena froze, suddenly aware that she was trespassing, that she had stumbled into someone's carefully hidden world. She began to back away slowly, trying to move silently, but a twig snapped beneath her foot with a crack that echoed through the quiet forest. A door opened in the nearest structure, and a voice called out, not harsh or angry but gentle, almost welcoming. A woman emerged, stepping into the dappled sunlight with the easy confidence of someone on their own land. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical braid, and a face that was deeply lined but kind, weathered by sun and wind but softened by eyes the color of warm honey. Her hands, rough and capable, were stained with soil from gardening, and she wore simple, sturdy clothes that had been mended many times. She looked at Elena with an expression that was not surprise or alarm but something closer to recognition. as if she had been expecting someone to eventually find this place. She stopped a respectful distance away, giving Elena space, and when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet strength of someone who had survived great trials and emerged with their compassion intact. Her name, she said, was Sarah, and her first words were not a challenge or a demand, but a question that cut straight to the heart of everything Elena had been running from and toward. "Are you running from something, child, or running toward something?" Elena stood frozen, her body swaying slightly from exhaustion, unable to formulate an answer to Sarah's question that felt adequate or true, because the honest answer was both. She was running from everything and toward nothing, fleeing with no destination in mind beyond a way. Sarah seemed to understand without words, and she stepped forward slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal, and gently took Elena's bleeding hands in her own weathered ones, examining the torn blisters with a soft sound of sympathy. Without asking permission, she guided Elena toward the main dwelling, supporting her weight as her legs threatened to give out again, and led her inside into a world that felt impossibly warm and safe. The interior was simple but carefully made, with stone walls and wooden beams, a fire crackling in a beautifully constructed hearth, and the rich smell of something cooking that made Elena's empty stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. 3 people looked up as they entered, their faces showing varying degrees of surprise and concern. The oldest was a man in his 70s, tall and lean with a shock of white hair and eyes that were sharp and intelligent behind wire-rimmed glasses, his weathered face bearing the marks of someone who had spent a lifetime thinking deeply about difficult problems. This was Thomas, and he rose from the table where he had been reading a book with pages so worn they looked ready to crumble, his movements careful and measured. Beside him sat a woman in her 40s with Thomas's same intelligent eyes but softened by a warmth that radiated from her. Her dark hair streaked with gray and pulled back in a simple ponytail. And Elena noticed the sturdy wooden cane leaning against her chair, noticed the way she shifted her weight to accommodate an injury or condition that had clearly been with her for a long time. This was Grace, Thomas's daughter, and her smile as she looked at Elena was genuine and uncomplicated, the smile of someone who understood what it meant to need sanctuary. The third person was closer to Elena's own age, a teenage boy, perhaps 16 or 17, with his mother's warm eyes and his grandfather's sharp features, lean and sun-browned from a life spent outdoors, and he stood near the stove stirring the pot that was producing that incredible smell, his expression curious but not hostile. This was Marcus, and when his eyes met Elena's, she saw in them a reflection of her own isolation, a recognition that passed between 2 people who had both grown up outside the normal world. Sarah guided Elena to a chair at the worn wooden table and began tending to her hands with a gentleness that brought tears to Elena's eyes, cleaning the wounds with warm water and wrapping them in soft cloth bandages while Grace ladled thick vegetable soup into a heavy ceramic bowl and placed it in front of her with a piece of dark bread still warm from baking. Elena tried to eat slowly, tried to maintain some dignity, but the hunger was too powerful, and she devoured the meal while the family watched with understanding rather than judgment. It was only after she had eaten, after the warmth of the food and the fire had begun to seep into her bones and the immediate crisis of survival had passed, that Thomas spoke. His voice was measured and kind, the voice of a teacher or a scientist accustomed to explaining complex things with patience, and he told her the outline of their story without yet filling in the devastating details. They had been on this island for over a decade, he said, living in deliberate isolation, hidden from a world that had tried to destroy them for reasons they would explain when she was rested and ready to hear. They were a makeshift family bound not by blood alone but by shared survival, by the choice to protect each other against impossible odds, and if Elena needed a place to hide, a place to heal, a place to simply exist without fear, they were offering it to her. No questions asked, no conditions attached, for as long as she needed, because they understood better than most what it meant to have nowhere else to go. The first full days on the island passed in a haze of discovery and wonder that felt almost dreamlike to Elena, who had spent 11 years in an institution where every moment was regimented, every action monitored, and every small comfort earned through careful navigation of arbitrary rules and the director's volatile moods. Here, life moved to a different rhythm entirely, one dictated not by bells and punishments but by the tides, the weather, the cycles of the sun and moon, and the practical demands of survival in a place removed from the infrastructure of the modern world. Sarah woke her gently on that first morning, the dawn light filtering through the small window of the room they had given her. A space that was simple but clean, with a real bed and handmade quilts that smelled of lavender and sea air. And after a breakfast of eggs from chickens Elena had not yet seen and bread still warm from the oven, the family began to show her how they lived. Thomas explained their systems with the patient enthusiasm of a teacher who genuinely loved his subject, walking her through the island's hidden infrastructure. They were completely self-sufficient, he told her, a necessity born of their isolation and the danger of any contact with the outside world. Fresh water came from an ingenious rainwater collection system he had designed, with gutters channeling water from the roof into large storage tanks buried in the hillside, filtered through layers of sand and charcoal he had constructed himself. Power came from a small solar array carefully positioned in a natural clearing where the panels were invisible from the water, their angle adjusted seasonally to capture maximum sunlight, feeding batteries that provided enough electricity for lights, a small refrigerator, and the essential communication equipment Thomas maintained. Food came from multiple sources. A remarkable garden hidden in a sheltered valley on the island's southern side where the soil was rich and the high walls provided protection from the harsh ocean winds. Fruit trees that Grace had been carefully cultivating for years, the chickens that ranged freely through the forest, and most importantly, the ocean itself. It was Marcus who taught Elena this last and most essential skill, leading her down to the rocky shore in the early morning when the tide was right, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had been navigating this treacherous landscape since he was small. He showed her where they had positioned the fishing nets in the channels between rocks, how to check them without damaging the delicate mesh, how to read the water and know when the tide pools would be safe to navigate and when they would be death traps of surging waves and hidden currents. He taught her which shellfish were safe to harvest and which to avoid, how to use a simple spear to catch the small fish that darted through the shallows, and how to move across wet rocks without slipping, placing each foot with care and always maintaining 3 points of contact. As they worked together, Marcus talked easily, telling her about the island's moods and seasons, about the storms that came in winter and the unexpected calms of summer, and Elena found herself responding, sharing small pieces of her own story, feeling for the first time in her life what it was like to have a conversation with someone her own age who did not see her as competition or threat, but simply as another person. Over those first days, as her hands healed and her strength returned, Elena felt something shifting deep inside her. A tension she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was there, beginning to loosen its grip. She was given tasks and trusted to complete them, assigned responsibilities that mattered to the family's survival, and when she made mistakes, as she inevitably did, she was gently corrected rather than punished, taught rather than shamed. For the first time in her life, Elena experienced what it felt like to be part of something real, to be welcomed rather than merely tolerated, to be valued not for what she could endure but for what she could contribute, and the feeling was so foreign and so precious that sometimes, working in the garden beside Grace or mending nets with Sarah, she had to stop and breathe through the overwhelming gratitude that threatened to bring tears to her eyes. On her 5th day on the island, while Marcus and Thomas were out checking the furthest fishing nets and Grace was resting in the main house, Elena found herself exploring the areas of the settlement she had not yet seen, driven by a curiosity that was part natural interest and part the old survival instinct from the orphanage that had taught her to always know her surroundings, to map every exit and hiding place. Sarah had given her permission to look around freely, understanding that trust had to be built on transparency, and so Elena wandered among the smaller outbuildings that served as storage for tools, preserved food, and equipment. Most were simple structures, their contents exactly what one would expect from a self-sufficient community. Fishing gear neatly organized on hooks, garden tools clean and well-maintained, shelves of canned vegetables and dried fish, coils of rope and spare lumber. But one building, set slightly apart from the others and built partially into the hillside, was different. The front portion was a normal storage shed, but as Elena moved deeper inside, she noticed that the back wall was not wood but natural rock, the living stone of the island itself, and set into that rock face was a heavy steel door that looked completely out of place in this rustic setting. It was not old or rusted but relatively modern, the kind of security door you would find in a bank vault or a laboratory, and it was secured with a serious padlock that was equally out of character with the simple wooden buildings that surrounded it. Elena stood before the door for a long moment, her hand hovering over the cold metal, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was clearly off limits, a boundary she was not meant to cross, and yet the presence of something so secured, so hidden, on an island where everything else was open and shared, filled her with questions that burned in her mind. She found Sarah in the garden, her hands deep in the rich soil as she harvested carrots, and when Elena approached and asked about the locked door, she saw the older woman's entire body stiffen, saw her kind face transform into something harder, older, marked by a pain that had never fully healed. Sarah stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands, and guided Elena to a bench at the garden's edge where they could sit and talk privately. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet and heavy with the weight of years of fear and loss. That room, she said, contained the reason they could never leave this island, the reason they had been living in hiding for over a decade, the reason they had given up everything they had known and loved. It held proof, she explained, documentation and evidence of something terrible, something that powerful people had done and would do anything to keep hidden. She did not elaborate, did not fill in the details that would make the statement concrete and real, but the darkness in her eyes told Elena that whatever was behind that door had cost this family dearly. They kept it locked not just to protect it from the elements or from accidental damage, but because even looking at it, even engaging with it, meant reliving trauma that had never fully healed. Sarah reached out and took Elena's hand, her weathered fingers warm and strong, and promised her that when the time was right, when Elena was stronger and more settled, when she had decided whether this island would be a temporary refuge or something more permanent, they would tell her everything. They would open that door and show her why they lived like ghosts, and why anyone who discovered their secret would almost certainly try to destroy them to protect their own interests, but not yet, not while Elena was still healing from whatever had driven her to steal a boat and row into the unknown. The sharing began gradually over the evening meals, those sacred times when the family gathered around the heavy wooden table with the fire crackling in the hearth and the darkness pressing against the windows, when the day's work was done and the island settled into its nighttime quiet. Sarah would serve the food she and Grace had prepared, simple but nourishing meals made from the garden's harvest and the ocean's bounty, and as they ate, the conversation would drift from the practical matters of daily survival to deeper waters, to the past that had brought them to this isolated shore. It was Thomas who began the real telling, his scientist's mind organizing the information methodically, starting with the facts before moving to the horror they revealed. He had been, he explained, a lead environmental scientist for Meridian Biotech, a major pharmaceutical corporation with a reputation for cutting-edge research and a public commitment to global health initiatives. He had been proud of his work, believing genuinely that he was contributing to the development of medications that would help people, and Grace, who had earned her doctorate in biochemistry, had worked as his research assistant, the two of them forming a formidable team investigating how environmental factors affected the efficacy and safety of new pharmaceutical compounds. Their research had taken them to communities around the world, to places where Meridian was conducting field trials of new drugs, and for years everything had seemed legitimate, the work challenging but ethical, the results promising. But then, about 15 years ago, Thomas had begun to notice inconsistencies in the data they were receiving from other research teams, patterns that did not make sense if the trials were being conducted according to proper protocols. Grace, with her keen eye for detail, had noticed it too. Communities near certain water sources were showing unusual clusters of specific symptoms. And when they cross-referenced those locations with Meridian's research sites, the correlation was impossible to ignore. They began to investigate quietly, collecting water samples from areas where Meridian was supposedly conducting standard pharmaceutical trials, and what they found in their own laboratory analysis made them physically sick. The water was contaminated with experimental compounds, substances that had not yet been approved for human testing, chemicals that Meridian was introducing deliberately into the water supply of impoverished communities to observe the effects on real human populations without their knowledge or consent. It was not just unethical, it was a crime against humanity, a systematic poisoning of the most vulnerable people for the sake of research data that could not be obtained through legitimate means. Thomas and Grace had compiled their evidence meticulously, documenting everything, cross-referencing water samples with health records they obtained through contacts in local clinics, building an irrefutable case. When they tried to go public, when they took their findings to regulatory authorities and to the media, believing in the systems designed to prevent such atrocities, they discovered how deep Meridian's influence truly ran. Within days of their first contact with a journalist, Thomas received threats. His home was broken into, though nothing was taken, and Grace was followed by men in unmarked cars. The message was clear: abandon this investigation or face consequences. But they could not abandon it, could not unsee what they had seen or unknow what they knew, and so they pressed forward. And that was when Meridian stopped making threats and started taking action. When the family's world exploded into violence, and they were forced to make a choice between their principles and their survival, a choice that had brought them to this island and kept them here, living as ghosts, for over a decade. It was Sarah who told the story of the night itself, the night 15 years ago when their old life ended and this strange, isolated existence began, and as she spoke, her hands trembled slightly around her cup of tea. Her eyes focused not on the warm room around her, but on memories that still had the power to terrify. She described how it had been late, past midnight, and she had been putting 3-year-old Marcus to bed in their comfortable suburban home, a place that had felt safe and normal, when Thomas had burst through the door with Grace right behind him, both of them pale and frantic, saying they had to leave immediately, that there was no time to pack, no time to plan. Through the window, Sarah had seen the vehicles pulling up, large black SUVs with no markings, and men emerging from them, men who moved with military precision and carried themselves with the confidence of people who operated outside the normal constraints of law. These were not police, they were Meridian's private security forces, and they had come not to arrest but to eliminate, to destroy the evidence and anyone who had seen it. Thomas had grabbed the emergency bags he had prepared after the threats began, bags containing hard drives with copies of all their research data, boxes of original documents and water samples. Anything that could prove what Meridian had done, and Sarah had scooped up Marcus, still half asleep and confused, wrapping him in a blanket as they fled through the back door just seconds before the front door was kicked in. They ran through the dark neighborhood, hearing shouts behind them and the sound of their home being torn apart, and Grace, who had injured her leg badly jumping a fence in their escape, limped between her parents, biting back cries of pain that would have given away their position. They had made it to a car Thomas had hidden 3 blocks away, a precaution that had seemed paranoid until that moment, and they drove through the night, constantly checking mirrors for pursuit, eventually abandoning the car and switching to a boat Thomas had arranged through an old friend who asked no questions. The island had been Thomas's inheritance from his grandfather, a man who had valued solitude and had spent his final years in a small cabin on this remote piece of rock that appeared on no modern maps because it had been privately owned for generations and deliberately kept off official surveys. Thomas had visited it as a child, remembered it as a place outside the reach of the world, and in their desperate flight, it was the only destination that made sense. They arrived exhausted, traumatized, with a 3-year-old child who did not understand why his home was gone, why his toys were left behind, why his whole world had changed in a single terrifying night. They had intended it to be temporary, Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly, a place to hide while they figured out how to safely release the evidence, how to find allies who could not be bought or threatened by Meridian's power. But days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and every attempt to reach out to the outside world, every carefully worded message sent through encrypted channels to journalists or government officials, either went unanswered or resulted in increased search activity in their region, boats appearing on the horizon, helicopters flying search patterns. They realized slowly, painfully, that Meridian's reach was too vast, their resources too deep, and the family made the devastating choice to simply disappear, to live as ghosts on this island, raising Marcus in isolation, unable to return to the world without facing certain death. The silence that followed Sarah's story was heavy and profound, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of waves against the shore, and Elena felt the weight of their trust like a physical thing pressing against her chest, demanding reciprocation, demanding honesty. She had been a stranger who appeared on their beach less than a week ago, and they had opened their home and their deepest wounds to her. And she knew with a clarity that was almost painful that she owed them the same vulnerability, the same truth. So she began to speak, haltingly at first, her voice rough with emotion she had spent years learning to suppress, telling them about Riverside State Orphanage, about the 11 years she had spent within its gray walls after her mother died and no relatives could be found to claim her. She described Director Margaret Voss, a woman who presented herself to the outside world as a dedicated public servant, committed to the welfare of forgotten children, but who behind closed doors was a tyrant whose cruelty was methodical and carefully calibrated to leave no visible evidence. Elena told them about the punishments for minor infractions, the deliberate withholding of food or warmth, the psychological warfare of pitting children against each other, the casual violence disguised as discipline that left bruises where inspectors would never look. She saw Grace's face tighten with anger, and Sarah reach across the table to take her hand, and the simple gesture of solidarity nearly broke her composure entirely. But she pressed on, because there was more, something darker that she had discovered only in the final weeks before her escape, something that had transformed her desperation into genuine terror. She had been assigned to cleaning duty in the administrative offices, a rotating punishment that involved scrubbing floors and emptying trash, and it was during one of these sessions that she had found the documents. Director Voss had been called away unexpectedly, leaving her office unlocked, and Elena, driven by a curiosity born of years of unanswered questions about why the orphanage was so poorly funded despite being a state institution, had looked through the papers on her desk. What she found made no sense at first. Financial records showing large monthly payments deposited into the orphanage's accounts from an unnamed corporate donor. Amounts that dwarfed the state funding and should have meant better food, better facilities, better everything, but the money never seemed to reach the children. She had dug deeper, looking through files she knew she should not touch, and discovered something even more disturbing. Children were disappearing from the records, not through adoption or transfer to other facilities as should have been documented, but simply erased. Their files altered to show they had never existed or moved to locations that, when Elena looked them up later in the library, turned out to be non-existent addresses. Over the past 3 years, at least 15 children had vanished from the system, and no one seemed to be asking questions. No one seemed to care. Elena had been searching Voss's office for more evidence, for anything that might explain what was happening to these children, when she found the map tucked in that drawer. An antique chart showing an island that did not appear on any modern survey, and she had taken it not because she understood its significance, but because it represented escape, a place that existed outside the system that was devouring children. She had stolen the map, hoping it might lead to evidence, or at least to a sanctuary where she could hide while she figured out what to do with the terrible knowledge she carried, never imagining that the island itself would hold answers, that the family she would find here might be connected to the same darkness she was fleeing. Thomas's face went pale as Elena described the documents, the color draining from his weathered features so quickly that Sarah reached out to steady him, and he stood abruptly from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the keys he kept on a chain around his neck. He left the room without a word, moving with an urgency that bordered on panic, and the others sat in tense silence. Grace's eyes wide with dawning horror, as if she too was beginning to see the connections forming. When Thomas returned minutes later, he was carrying a file box, one of the containers they had salvaged from their old life, and his hands shook so badly that he nearly dropped it as he set it on the table. He rifled through the contents with frantic energy, pulling out folders and photographs and thick binders of research notes until he found what he was looking for. A manila folder marked with a label that made Elena's blood run cold, even before she understood its significance: Project Genesis. Thomas spread the documents across the table with the careful precision of someone handling evidence, and as Elena looked at the pages, at the clinical language and the detailed protocols, she felt a sickness rising in her throat that had nothing to do with physical illness and everything to do with the recognition of evil dressed in the language of science. Project Genesis, according to Thomas's meticulous notes from his time at Meridian, was a secret initiative that ran parallel to the water contamination experiments, designed to address what Meridian's executives saw as a limitation of environmental exposure testing: the inability to control dosage and monitor individual responses in real time. The solution they had devised was monstrous in its simplicity and its cruelty. They would identify vulnerable, undocumented children from state institutions, children whose disappearance would not trigger investigations because they existed in a system that was already overwhelmed and underfunded, children who had no advocates, no families to ask questions. These children would be transferred through a network of shell companies and corrupt officials to facilities where they could be used as test subjects for experimental pharmaceuticals, their responses monitored, their bodies treated as laboratory equipment, their lives considered expendable in the pursuit of data. Thomas's notes included a list of institutions that Meridian had identified as potential sources, And there, third from the top, was Riverside State Orphanage. He pulled out another document, a financial report he had copied before fleeing, showing the corporate structure of Meridian's shell companies, and he traced the connections with a shaking finger. The unnamed donor making payments to Riverside was Summit Care Solutions, which was wholly owned by Meridian Health Services, which was a subsidiary of Meridian Biotech. Elena stared at the documents, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what she was seeing, the terrible nearness of the danger she had escaped. She had not just been running from Director Voss's cruelty. She had been running from a vast corporate machine that saw her and children like her not as human beings but as expendable raw material, test subjects to be used and discarded in the name of profit and efficiency. The 15 children who had disappeared from the orphanage's records had not simply been erased. They had been harvested, taken to whatever facility Meridian used for its testing. And the thought of what might have happened to them, what their final days might have been like, made Elena's hands clench into fists on the table. She looked up at Thomas, at the guilt and horror written plainly on his face, and understood that he felt responsible, that he had known about Project Genesis, had tried to stop it, and had failed. And now here was living proof of that failure sitting at his table, a 17-year-old girl who had nearly become another victim of the system he had been unable to destroy. The moment hung suspended, Elena staring at the documents that revealed how close she had come to a fate worse than anything she had imagined, when the door burst open with a force that made everyone at the table jump. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face flushed from running, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath, and in his hand was the handheld marine radio they kept for monitoring weather reports and Coast Guard activity, the device crackling with static. He did not apologize for the interruption or wait for permission to speak. The urgency in his eyes conveyed that whatever he had heard superseded all normal protocols. He set the radio on the table, his voice tight with controlled panic as he explained that he had been doing his usual evening scan of the maritime channels, a routine task he performed daily to monitor for any unusual activity in their waters, when he picked up a transmission that made his blood run cold. A private vessel, he said, a 40-foot cruiser far more sophisticated than the fishing boats that occasionally passed their waters, had been making inquiries at every coastal town within 100 miles, asking about a missing girl from a state orphanage. The transmission Marcus had intercepted was from the vessel's captain reporting back to someone on shore, and in that conversation, he had mentioned details that were too specific to be coincidental. A 17-year-old female, brown hair, last seen fleeing Riverside State Orphanage 8 days ago, considered dangerous and disturbed, and there was a substantial reward being offered for any information leading to her recovery. Thomas took the radio and adjusted the frequency, his practiced hands finding the channel Marcus indicated, and they sat in tense silence listening to the periodic updates. The vessel was registered to Blackstone Security Solutions, a name that made Thomas's jaw clench because he knew it well. Blackstone was one of the primary security contractors Meridian used for sensitive operations. The same firm that had sent the men who raided their home 15 years ago. Director Voss, it seemed, had not simply reported Elena as a runaway to local authorities. She had called in corporate allies, had activated the same network that had been hunting Thomas and his family for over a decade, and the search was being conducted with a level of resources and determination that spoke to how valuable Elena was to them, how desperately they wanted her back. Grace leaned forward, her face pale in the lamplight, and voiced what they were all thinking. The searchers were being methodical, starting at the orphanage and working outward along the coast, interviewing anyone who might have seen a girl matching Elena's description, and while the island was remote and forgotten, it was not completely unknown. There were old fishermen in the coastal towns who still remembered the stories their fathers had told, tales of a strange island that appeared on antique charts but not modern ones, a place where some recluse had lived generations ago. It would only take one person remembering those stories, one casual mention to the wrong person, and the search would turn their direction. The sanctuary that had protected Thomas's family for 15 years was about to be tested as never before, and this time the threat was not abstract or distant but immediate and closing in. A tightening noose that was drawing ever closer to their hidden shore. And they had perhaps days, perhaps only hours, before their world of careful isolation came crashing down around them. The revelation that they were being actively hunted transformed the warm, comfortable dwelling into a command center operating with military precision. And within minutes, the family had shifted into a mode of operation that was clearly well rehearsed. the product of 15 years of planning for a scenario they had hoped would never come. Thomas moved with purpose to the locked archive, returning with armloads of file boxes that he and Grace immediately began sorting through on the large table, their hands moving quickly as they identified the most critical documents: the water contamination data, the internal Meridian memos authorizing Project Genesis, the financial records linking shell companies to orphanages and medical facilities, the lists of victims and test sites. Grace pulled out a device that looked like a portable scanner and began methodically photographing each page, creating digital copies that she transferred to multiple USB drives, each one small enough to hide in a pocket or swallow if necessary. Thomas worked beside her, selecting original documents that were too valuable to risk losing, sealing them in heavy-duty waterproof containers designed for deep-sea survival, the kind that could withstand immersion and impact. He explained as he worked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, that they had learned long ago never to keep all their evidence in one place, that survival meant redundancy, and so they would create multiple complete sets of the proof, hiding them in different locations across the island in case the archive itself was discovered and destroyed. Meanwhile, Sarah and Marcus were outside in the growing darkness, moving with practiced efficiency to reinforce the island's camouflage, the careful illusions that had kept them hidden for so long. Marcus climbed onto the roof of the main dwelling, adjusting the living sod and moss that covered it, ensuring no straight lines or unnatural shapes were visible from above, while Sarah worked on the ground level, strategically placing cut branches and vegetation to break up the geometric shapes of doorways and windows that might catch a searcher's eye. They scattered leaves and debris across the well-worn paths, making them look less deliberately maintained, and checked every reflective surface, every piece of metal or glass that might catch sunlight and betray their presence. Elena watched this coordinated activity with a growing sense of anguish that sat like a stone in her chest, because she understood with painful clarity that this danger was her fault, that her arrival had brought the enemy to their door, that the sanctuary these people had built and maintained for 15 years was now threatened because she had been selfish enough to seek refuge without considering the consequences. She tried to express this, her voice breaking as she apologized, but Sarah cut her off with a firmness that was almost harsh. Taking Elena's face in her weathered hands and telling her that she would not accept guilt for running from evil, that the blame belonged entirely to those who had created the system that made children into prey. Grace called Elena over to the table, her voice gentle but urgent, and showed her a device that looked like an old-fashioned satellite phone, bulky and outdated but functional. This phone, Grace explained, had only one purpose and one number programmed into it, and that number belonged to Rachel Chen, an investigative journalist who had tried to help their family years ago, who had believed their story when no one else would, and who had nearly lost her own career for pursuing it. Rachel had given them this phone before they disappeared, making them promise that if they ever had the complete evidence, if they ever had witnesses and documentation strong enough to bring Meridian down, they would call her and she would bring the full weight of the media and law enforcement to their aid. Grace showed Elena how to activate the phone, how to use its encryption features, and made her repeat the process until it was automatic, because in an emergency, Grace said, her voice heavy with the weight of experience, there might not be time to think, only time to act. The evening that followed their frantic preparations was strange in its quiet intensity, the family having done all they could to ready themselves for the coming threat, and now left with nothing but waiting and the work of organizing evidence that might be their only weapon. Elena sat at the heavy wooden table beside Sarah, carefully sealing documents into waterproof pouches, her hands moving mechanically, while her mind churned with guilt and fear and a desperate wish that she could undo her arrival, could spare these kind people the danger she had brought to their door. The lamplight cast warm shadows across the room, and outside the window, the ocean was a vast darkness punctuated by the rhythmic sound of waves. And in this quiet moment, Sarah set down the document she was holding and turned to face Elena fully, her weathered face serious and her honey-colored eyes holding something that looked like wonder mixed with sadness. She reached out and took Elena's hands, stilling their nervous movement. And when she spoke, her voice was soft but carried the weight of a revelation that had been building since the moment Elena had stumbled onto their shore. Sarah told her that they had not found her by accident, that the universe did not work in such simple coincidences, and she explained something that made Elena's breath catch in her throat and her heart hammer against her ribs. Thomas, she said, had known Elena's name before she ever spoke it, had recognized it the moment she introduced herself because it was written in the Meridian files he had saved. Listed among the children marked for Project Genesis. Elena had been on their list, Sarah continued, her voice gentle as if delivering news of a death, scheduled for transfer in the next phase of trials. One of 20 children from Riverside Orphanage that Meridian had identified as suitable subjects based on their lack of family connections, their age, their health profiles, their complete vulnerability. Thomas had seen that list years ago, had copied it along with all the other evidence, and he had carried the weight of those names ever since. 20 children he could not save. 20 lives he had failed to protect when he was forced to flee and hide rather than fight. When Elena had appeared on their beach, exhausted and desperate, and told them her name, Sarah said that Thomas had gone pale, had stepped outside to compose himself, because the sight of her alive and free was almost too much to bear, a miracle he had not dared to hope for. It was as if the universe, having taken so much from them all, having forced them into exile, and stolen 15 years of normal life, was giving them a second chance, was placing in their path one of the children they had been trying to save all along, giving them the opportunity to protect at least one life that Meridian had marked for destruction. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as the full meaning of Sarah's words sank in, as she understood that her connection to this family ran deeper than the simple kindness of strangers offering shelter to a runaway. She had not just found a family by random chance. She had found the family that had been fighting for her before they ever met, that had risked everything to expose the system that would have devoured her, that had been driven into hiding because they cared enough about children like her to sacrifice their own safety and comfort. Thomas and Grace, working across the room, had stopped what they were doing and were watching this exchange, and Elena saw in their faces the same mixture of grief for what had been lost and fierce joy for what had been unexpectedly found. Marcus, sitting by the fire, looked at Elena with new understanding, as if seeing her not just as a refugee like himself, but as someone his family had been connected to all along, a sister found rather than simply a stranger welcomed. Sarah pulled Elena into an embrace, and Elena, who had spent 11 years learning not to cry, not to show weakness, not to hope for comfort that would never come, finally allowed herself to break, sobbing into this woman's shoulder while Sarah held her and murmured that she was safe now, that they would protect her, that she was not alone and never would be again, that sometimes the family we need finds us in the most unexpected ways, and when it does, we hold on with everything we have. Marcus had volunteered for the first watch, climbing to the island's highest point in the pre-dawn darkness, a rocky outcrop that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding waters, and he settled there with the binoculars they kept wrapped in oilcloth, scanning the horizon as the sun began to rise and paint the ocean in shades of gold and pink. For the first 2 hours, he saw nothing unusual, a distant fishing trawler following its regular route, a flock of seabirds diving for prey, the endless roll of waves that was the constant soundtrack of their lives. But as the morning wore on and the light grew stronger, he caught a glint of something that made his stomach clench with dread. He focused the binoculars, adjusting the lenses with hands that had suddenly gone cold despite the warming day, and watched as a vessel came into clear view several miles offshore. It was not a fishing boat with its characteristic profile and working equipment, not a pleasure craft with people visible on deck enjoying the morning, and certainly not a Coast Guard cutter with its official markings and purposeful bearing. This was something else entirely, a sleek powerboat, perhaps 45 feet long, painted in dark colors that minimized its visibility, moving in a slow, methodical search pattern that any experienced observer would recognize as professional surveillance. Marcus watched it for 20 minutes, noting the way it circled and doubled back, the deliberate overlapping of its search grid, and he could see equipment on deck that looked far too sophisticated for recreational use, antenna arrays and what appeared to be a sonar rig, the kind of technology that could map the ocean floor and detect underwater structures or even the heat signatures of buildings on shore. His heart was racing as he scrambled down from his perch and ran back to the settlement, his feet finding the familiar path by instinct, and he burst into the main dwelling where the family was finishing breakfast, his arrival startling them all. He described what he had seen, his words tumbling out in a rush, and Thomas immediately grabbed the binoculars and headed back up to the high point with Marcus, leaving the women to begin the next phase of their preparation. When they returned an hour later, Thomas's face was grim, the last vestiges of hope that they might have more time visibly drained away. The boat was definitely Blackstone's security, he confirmed, and they were using equipment that could potentially detect the island's infrastructure, the solar panels, the water tanks, the very buildings they lived in. And while the family's camouflage was excellent, it was designed to fool visual inspection, not thermal imaging or ground-penetrating sonar. The island's time as a secret was running out, measured now not in weeks or days but in hours, and they had to assume that the searchers would find them, that it was only a matter of when, not if. Sarah started to say something about evacuation, about using their emergency boat to flee to another hiding place, but Thomas cut her off with a firmness that surprised them all, his voice carrying a resolve that had been building through 15 years of running, 15 years of hiding, 15 years of watching from the shadows, while Meridian continued its work unchecked. He said they would not run again, that he was done living like a ghost, done letting fear dictate every decision, done prioritizing their survival over the greater good. This time, he declared, they would fight, but they would fight smart, using the weapons they had, evidence, testimony, and the element of surprise. They would get the truth out before Meridian could silence them, would release everything to Rachel Chen and the authorities, would make so much noise that killing them would be pointless because the information would already be public, irretrievable, damning. It was a desperate plan, Thomas acknowledged, one that required perfect timing and more than a little luck. But it was also their only chance to end this, to stop running, to finally honor the children whose names filled those terrible files. And as he spoke, Elena saw the family transform, saw them shed the posture of victims and assume the bearing of soldiers preparing for a final, decisive battle. The decision to make the call was momentous, carrying with it the understanding that once they reached out, once they broke their silence and revealed their location even to an ally, there would be no going back. No return to the fragile safety of anonymity they had maintained for 15 years. Grace and Elena retreated to the small room that housed their communication equipment, a space Thomas had carefully shielded to prevent electronic detection. And Grace powered up the bulky satellite phone with hands that trembled slightly despite her outward calm. She handed the device to Elena, explaining that it should be her voice Rachel heard first, that a new witness, especially one who was herself a target of Project Genesis, would carry more weight than the family Rachel already knew, would signal that this was not just the same old evidence, but something expanded, something urgent and immediate. Elena held the phone, feeling the weight of it and the enormity of what this call meant, and with Grace's steady hand on her shoulder for support, she pressed the activation sequence Grace had taught her and dialed the single number programmed into the device. The line crackled and hissed with the peculiar quality of satellite transmission, and Elena's heart hammered so loudly she could hear it in her ears during the 3 rings before someone answered. The voice that came through was crisp and professional, a woman who identified herself as Rachel Chen, investigative journalist, and there was a pause, a held breath. When Elena said the words Grace had coached her to say, "I am calling on behalf of Thomas and Sarah, Grace and Marcus, the family from Meridian," the professional tone shattered immediately, replaced by something raw and emotional. And Rachel's voice shook as she said she remembered them, had never stopped looking for them, had built her entire career on the foundation they had laid, exposing corporate malfeasance and fighting for the victims of systems designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. She had always believed their story, Rachel said, had trusted that they were out there somewhere with the evidence that could bring Meridian down, and she had been laying groundwork for years, cultivating sources within the company, building relationships with federal prosecutors who specialized in corporate crime, waiting for the day when the family might resurface. When Elena explained who she was, that she was 17 and had just escaped from Riverside Orphanage, that she had been on Meridian's list for Project Genesis, and had found her way to the island by following a stolen map, Rachel's voice cracked with emotion that was part fury and part vindication. She asked rapid-fire questions about what evidence they had, whether they still possessed the original documents and data, whether they had witnesses who could testify. And when Grace took the phone and confirmed everything, describing the archive and the digital copies and Elena's first-hand knowledge of the financial arrangements at the orphanage, Rachel's response was immediate and decisive. She told them to stay hidden for exactly 48 hours, to maintain absolute radio silence after this call, because she was bringing the FBI, specifically agents from a task force that had been building a case against Meridian for years, following leads and rumors and whispers of the very crimes Thomas and Grace had documented. The family was the missing piece, Rachel said, her voice intense with certainty. The witnesses and evidence that could transform suspicion into prosecution. And she gave them specific GPS coordinates for a rendezvous point on the island's north shore, a sheltered cove where helicopters could land, where federal agents could secure the location and extract both the family and the evidence before Meridian knew what was happening. The call lasted less than 10 minutes, but when it ended and Elena and Grace emerged from the communication room, they found the others waiting with expressions of desperate hope. And Grace delivered the news that set everything in motion. Help was coming, justice was finally within reach, and all they had to do was survive for 48 more hours. The 48 hours that followed the call to Rachel Chen stretched like an eternity. Each minute weighted with the terrible knowledge that their fate hung in a balance between rescue and discovery, between vindication and annihilation, and the family moved through those hours like shadows, speaking only in whispers, maintaining absolute radio silence as instructed, staying hidden in their concealed shelters, and venturing out only when absolutely necessary. The security vessel had not left. If anything, its search pattern had grown more methodical and more thorough. The sleek powerboat cutting back and forth across the waters surrounding the island in increasingly tight circles. And there were moments when it came so dangerously close to shore that Elena, watching from a hidden vantage point with her heart in her throat, could see the men on deck clearly through the binoculars, could see their tactical gear and their professional bearing, and the sophisticated equipment they swept across the water like hunters searching for prey. Thomas had divided them into watch shifts, positioning lookouts at 3 different high points around the island to ensure they had complete coverage of the surrounding waters. And he taught Elena and Marcus a series of hand signals borrowed from his long-ago military training. Simple gestures that could convey complex information without sound. Danger approaching. All clear. Fall back to shelter. Gather at meeting point. Elena and Marcus took the longest shifts together. The 2 youngest members of the family paired because Thomas trusted their sharp eyes and quick reflexes. And during those long, quiet hours of watching and waiting, crouched together behind rocks or hidden in the thick foliage, they began to talk in whispers so soft they were barely audible even to each other. Marcus confessed something that made Elena's chest ache with shared sorrow. He barely remembered life before the island, his memories of their suburban home and his early childhood reduced to disconnected fragments. A yellow bedroom with trucks painted on the walls, the smell of his grandmother's perfume, the sound of his mother laughing before the injury that left her walking with a cane. But these images were like photographs rather than lived experiences, distant and unreal. The island was the only home he truly knew, he said, and there was sadness in his voice but also a kind of peace, an acceptance of the life he had been given, even as he mourned the one that had been stolen from him. Elena understood that feeling completely, and she told him about the orphanage, about the years of learning to make herself small and invisible, of surviving rather than living, of never having a place that felt like home or people who felt like family, and she said something that surprised her even as the words left her mouth. That maybe this island was not the prison Marcus sometimes thought it was. Maybe it was not a place of exile and hiding, but the first real home either of them had ever known, the first place where they had been valued and trusted and loved not for what they could endure but simply for who they were. They watched the sun set and rise again, watched the security vessel prowl the waters like a shark that could sense blood but could not quite locate its source, and they counted down the hours with a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that Rachel would arrive as promised with the power of law and media behind her. Dread that Meridian would find them first, that these 48 hours would stretch just a few hours too long and everything would be lost. But in those quiet moments between fear and waiting, sitting shoulder to shoulder on sun-warmed rocks or huddled together against the night chill, Elena and Marcus formed a bond that went deeper than friendship, a connection between 2 people who had both had their childhoods stolen by forces beyond their control, and who had found in each other and in this strange makeshift family something worth fighting for, something worth protecting, something that felt like the home they had both been searching for without knowing it. The morning of the second day broke clear and cold, the sun rising over an ocean that looked deceptively peaceful. And Elena was on watch at the eastern observation point when she saw the security vessel finally stop its endless circling and turn with purpose toward the island. She signaled immediately to Marcus at the western point, the urgent gesture that meant danger imminent, and he relayed it to Thomas at the central position. And within seconds, the family was moving to their predetermined positions, each person knowing exactly where to go and what to do because they had rehearsed this scenario countless times over the years. Through the binoculars, Elena watched with her heart hammering as an inflatable boat was lowered from the security vessel's stern, and 6 men climbed down into it with the practiced efficiency of professionals, each one wearing black tactical gear and carrying weapons that were decidedly not standard civilian equipment. They were not trying to be subtle, not attempting to approach quietly or maintain the fiction that this was a legitimate Coast Guard inspection or a friendly check on possible stranded boaters. They were a show of force, a message that resistance would be futile, and as the inflatable's powerful outboard motor roared to life and carried them toward the island's main beach, Elena felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She focused the binoculars on the man at the front of the boat, the one clearly in command, and her breath caught as recognition slammed into her. She had seen this face before in Thomas's old files, in the photographs he had kept of Meridian's key personnel. Victor Kane, head of Meridian's security operations, a former military contractor who had built his reputation on making problems disappear quietly and permanently. His presence here meant this was not a reconnaissance mission or a preliminary search. This was the endgame, the final move by an enemy that had decided subtlety was no longer necessary. Elena abandoned her position and ran through the forest using the hidden paths they had marked, reaching the main dwelling just as the others were gathering their emergency packs. And she breathlessly told them what she had seen, described Kane and the tactical team, and Thomas's face went hard with a determination that was almost frightening in its intensity. He had prepared for this, he said, had spent years creating fallback positions and escape routes, and now they would use the deepest and most secure of them all. A natural cave system on the island's western side that he had discovered during his first explorations and had been carefully preparing ever since, stocking it with supplies, creating hidden entrances, ensuring it could serve as both shelter and fortress. They moved quickly, Grace, despite her leg keeping pace through sheer determination, Sarah carrying the most critical evidence in a waterproof pack, Marcus and Elena each taking bundles of supplies, and Thomas bringing up the rear, pausing to obscure their tracks and reset the camouflage that would make the settlement look abandoned and unused. They could hear the tactical team behind them now, voices calling to each other in crisp professional tones, the sound of boots on the rocky beach, the beginning of a systematic search that would move inland in a standard grid pattern. The family reached the cave entrance, a narrow fissure in the rock face hidden behind a curtain of thick vines and requiring them to squeeze through single file, and one by one they disappeared into the darkness of the earth, into the shelter Thomas had prepared for exactly this scenario, pulling the vines back into place behind them and descending into the cool, damp silence of stone, leaving no trace on the surface that they had ever been there at all. The cave system became their fortress and their labyrinth, a network of passages and chambers that Thomas had mapped over years of patient exploration. And from its depths, they could hear the muted sounds of the search above, boots crunching on stone, voices calling coordinates and search patterns, the professional efficiency of men who were very good at finding people who did not want to be found. But the mercenaries, for all their training and equipment, were searching an unfamiliar landscape, operating on maps that were incomplete and outdated, unable to account for the subtle features and hidden paths that the family knew as intimately as the rooms of their own home. Thomas led them through passages so narrow they had to crawl, through chambers where the ceiling dripped with cold water that had filtered through centuries of stone, always moving, never staying in one place long enough to be cornered, using the island's geography as their ally. They could track the searchers' progress by sound, could hear them calling to each other as they checked the obvious locations first, the settlement buildings, the garden, the storage sheds. And when the tactical team began to spread out across the island in their systematic grid pattern, Thomas made the decision to move back to the surface, to use the dense forest and rocky terrain to their advantage rather than remain trapped underground where they could be sealed in if the cave entrance was discovered. They emerged from a secondary exit on the island's northern slope, one that opened behind a screen of thick evergreens, and moved like ghosts through the landscape, using trails that were invisible to anyone who had not walked them 1,000 times, communicating with the hand signals that had become their silent language. At one point, when they could hear searchers dangerously close on 2 sides, Marcus volunteered to create a diversion, and before anyone could stop him, he was gone, moving with the confidence of someone who had grown up in this wilderness, climbing to a section of the island's eastern cliffs where centuries of erosion had left a precarious overhang of loose rock. Elena, watching from a hidden vantage point with her heart in her throat, saw him reach the spot, saw him use a long branch as a lever, and then the world erupted with the thunderous sound of a rock slide. Tons of stone cascading down the cliff face in a roar that echoed across the entire island. The effect was immediate, and exactly what Marcus had intended. 3 of the 6 searchers immediately broke off from their grid pattern and converged on the eastern cliffs. Their training overriding caution because a rock slide could mean injury, could mean their targets were trapped or exposed, and it gave the family precious minutes to relocate to a new hiding spot on the opposite side of the island. But even as they moved, even as they used every trick and advantage their knowledge of the island provided, Elena could feel the net tightening around them, could sense that they were running out of places to hide, running out of clever maneuvers that would buy them a few more minutes of freedom. Victor Kane's voice, when they heard it crackling over the radio one of the searchers was carrying, was calm and unhurried, the tone of a man who understood that this was a game of patience, that the island was only so large, that his targets had nowhere to go, no boat to escape in, no way off this piece of rock surrounded by miles of open ocean. He ordered his men to slow down, to be methodical rather than rushed, to check and double-check each location, because he knew what the family was beginning to understand with sinking dread. They could run, they could hide, they could use every advantage they possessed, but eventually time would run out, eventually they would be found, and their only hope now was that Rachel Chen and the FBI would arrive before Victor Kane's patience was rewarded with their capture. The family, hidden in a dense thicket on the island's northern ridge, heard the moment when Victor Kane and his remaining 3 men finally found the main settlement, heard the triumph in their voices as they called to each other that they had located structures, that the targets were definitely on the island, that it was only a matter of time now. Through careful observation from their concealed position, Elena watched as the tactical team moved through the dwelling with professional precision, clearing each room, searching for both people and evidence, and she saw the moment when Kane noticed the locked archive, saw him gesture to one of his men who produced a heavy-duty cutting tool from his pack. The sound of the tool biting into the steel door was a high-pitched scream that carried across the island, metal against metal, and it took them nearly 20 minutes to breach the serious lock and reinforced frame, their frustration evident in the increasingly aggressive way they attacked the barrier. When the door finally gave way and swung inward, Kane entered first with his weapon raised, clearly expecting either resistance or a treasure trove of damning evidence. And Elena could see his face clearly through the binoculars as he swept his flashlight across the interior of the small cave room. What he found there was not what he expected, and the confusion and then mounting anger that crossed his features was almost satisfying to witness. The archive was a decoy, exactly as Thomas had planned, a contingency he had prepared years ago against the possibility of exactly this scenario. The room contained filing cabinets full of old, useless equipment manuals, outdated research papers on benign topics, and files that looked important but contained nothing of substance. The kind of materials that would pass a cursory inspection but revealed nothing damning upon closer examination. Kane tore through the files with increasing violence, scattering papers across the cave floor, clearly recognizing that he had been tricked, that the real evidence was elsewhere. And as the minutes ticked by and his search yielded nothing of value, Elena could see his professional composure beginning to crack. The real archive, the evidence that actually mattered, was sealed in waterproof containers exactly as Thomas had prepared during their emergency protocols, hidden in 3 separate locations across the island. One buried beneath a distinctive rock formation on the southern shore, one concealed in a hollow tree in the densest part of the forest, and one submerged in a tide pool that was only accessible during the lowest tides. Kane would need weeks to search every possible hiding place on the island, and from the way he kept checking his watch, from the tension evident in his body language, it was clear he did not have weeks. He was operating under a deadline, under pressure from superiors who expected results, and his growing desperation led him to make a critical mistake. He pulled out a satellite phone, different from the radios his team had been using for internal communication, and he made a call, his voice tight with controlled fury as he reported the situation. The family, listening on the scanner Marcus had managed to retrieve from the settlement before retreating, heard every word with crystal clarity, and what they heard confirmed suspicions and revealed connections that were even more damning than they had imagined. Kane was calling Director Margaret Voss, speaking to her not as a client or a contact but as a superior, using the clipped professional language of employee to supervisor, reporting that the island location had been confirmed but the primary evidence had not yet been located, requesting additional time and resources, and Voss's response, crackling over the satellite connection, made Elena's blood run cold. The orphanage director was not just someone who had been bribed or coerced into cooperation. She was a direct employee of Meridian Biotech, part of their recruitment network for Project Genesis, specifically tasked with identifying and processing suitable children from state institutions. And she was furious that Elena had escaped, furious that her carefully maintained operation had been compromised, and she was ordering Kane to find the girl and eliminate everyone on the island, to clean up this mess before it could spiral further out of control and expose the entire network. Elena listened to the radio transmission with a rage so pure and white-hot it burned away every trace of fear she had been carrying, every remnant of the terrorized child who had cowered under Director Voss's ruler, because now she understood the full scope of the woman's evil, understood that Voss was not just cruel or sadistic but was a predator, a collaborator in something monstrous, someone who had spent years identifying vulnerable children and feeding them into a machine designed to use them up and discard them like laboratory equipment. The revelation transformed Elena's understanding of her entire childhood, reframing every punishment and every cold dismissal, not as random cruelty but as calculated dehumanization, preparing her to be a subject rather than a person. And the fury that knowledge ignited gave her a clarity and courage she had never possessed before. When Kane and his 2 remaining men finally cornered the family near the northern cliffs, having systematically eliminated every other hiding place through hours of patient searching, when they emerged from the tree line with weapons raised and faces set in grim professional determination, Elena made a choice that surprised even herself. She stepped out from behind the rocky outcrop where they had been concealed, her hands raised in surrender, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart as she called out to Kane that she would come peacefully if he let the others go, that she was the one he really wanted, the escaped asset from Riverside, the girl whose disappearance had triggered this entire operation. Thomas tried to grab her arm, to pull her back, but she shook him off gently, walking forward across the open ground with her hands visible, her eyes locked on Kane's cold professional gaze. And she saw the calculation there, saw him weighing options and outcomes with the detachment of someone for whom violence was simply a tool to be deployed when necessary. He agreed, his voice flat and emotionless, telling his men to lower their weapons, gesturing for Elena to come closer, and she did, each step carrying her farther from the family that had become hers, closer to the man who represented everything she had been running from. But even as she walked, even as Kane smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had finally captured his objective, Elena was counting, her lips moving silently with numbers that meant everything. Counting down the seconds to the exact moment Rachel Chen had specified, 48 hours from the time of their call, and she had been tracking that countdown obsessively, had synchronized her watch with Grace's during their preparation, had been marking off each minute with the focus of someone whose life depended on precise timing. Kane's smile faded as Elena came within a few feet of him, close enough that he could grab her but not yet close enough to trust, and she saw the moment when his professional instincts overrode his agreement, saw him recognize that letting witnesses live was never part of the plan, that his orders from Voss had been clear. He raised his weapon, not toward Elena but toward Thomas and Sarah and Grace and Marcus huddled together near the cliff's edge, and his 2 men did the same, creating a firing line that would eliminate everyone in seconds, and Elena saw the family's faces, saw their love and their terror and their desperate hope, and she did the only thing she could do. She smiled at Kane, a smile of pure, triumphant defiance that confused him, that made him hesitate for just a fraction of a second as he tried to understand what this captured girl could possibly have to smile about. And Elena, her lips still moving in her silent countdown, reached the number she had been waiting for, the number that meant everything, and she whispered just loud enough for Kane to hear, 0. The sound began as a distant rumble that could have been mistaken for thunder, but it grew rapidly into a deafening roar that shook the very air around them. And suddenly the sky above the northern ridge erupted with movement and power. 2 massive tactical helicopters crested the hilltop simultaneously, their black profiles stark against the bright morning sky, and they descended with the controlled aggression of predators that had finally located their prey, their rotor wash flattening the grass and sending debris swirling in violent circles. These were not local law enforcement aircraft but FBI tactical units, and painted clearly on their sides in bold white letters were the words that made Kane's face go pale. Federal Bureau of Investigation. But the helicopters were not alone, and as Kane and his men stood frozen in shock, their weapons now uncertain in their hands as they tried to process this overwhelming new threat, A third presence made itself known around the northern point of the island. A United States Coast Guard cutter, its deck bristling with personnel in tactical gear, rounded the rocky outcrop at speed, its powerful engines driving it directly toward the beach. And the message was unmistakable. The island was surrounded, escape was impossible, and resistance would be futile. Rachel Chen had not waited 48 hours as she had told them to. She had moved the moment she hung up the phone, had activated a federal task force that had been waiting for years for exactly this call, for the evidence and witnesses that could finally bring down Meridian Biotech's criminal enterprise, and the response had been immediate and overwhelming. The helicopters hovered just above the cliff tops, their side doors sliding open to reveal FBI agents in full tactical gear, and thick ropes dropped from the aircraft as agents began to rappel down with practiced precision, their boots hitting the ground in seconds, weapons raised and trained on Kane and his two men from multiple angles. A voice boomed from speakers mounted on the lead helicopter, amplified to godlike volume, announcing that this was the FBI, that the island was secured, that all weapons were to be dropped immediately and hands raised, and the authority in that voice left no room for negotiation or resistance. Kane's two mercenaries, professionals who understood when a situation had become untenable, dropped their weapons immediately and raised their hands, their faces showing not fear but the resigned acceptance of soldiers who had been outmaneuvered by superior tactics. But Kane himself stood frozen, his weapon still partially raised, his face a mask of disbelief as he stared at the helicopters and then at Elena, at the 17-year-old girl who was still smiling at him with that expression of fierce triumph, and the full magnitude of what had happened crashed over him like a wave. He had been outplayed, outthought, and outmaneuvered not by experienced federal agents or sophisticated intelligence operations, but by a teenage runaway and a family of ghosts who had survived 15 years in hiding by being smarter and more determined than everyone who problems hunted them. Elena had used herself as bait, had walked directly into his trap knowing that rescue was seconds away, had counted down those final moments with the certainty of someone who had absolute faith in her new family and the allies they had called. And Kane, who had built his reputation on being the hunter, the one who always caught his prey, realized with stunning clarity that he had been the prey all along. An FBI agent, moving with swift efficiency, kicked Kane's weapon from his hands and forced him to his knees, zip-tying his wrists behind his back with professional speed. And as more agents secured the scene and began calling all clear signals, Elena turned away from her captured enemy and ran to where Thomas, Sarah, Grace, and Marcus stood together, their faces showing shock and relief and joy so profound it brought tears to their eyes, and she threw herself into their waiting arms, finally safe, finally victorious, finally home. The island, which had been a sanctuary and a prison for 15 years, transformed within hours into a secured federal crime scene, with agents moving through it with methodical precision, documenting everything, photographing the settlement and the cave systems, interviewing each member of the family separately to build their testimonies, and most importantly, recovering the evidence that would bring down one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Thomas, finally able to stop hiding and start fighting back, led the FBI agents to the 3 hidden caches with a mixture of relief and vindication so powerful it made his hands shake as he pointed out the locations he had so carefully chosen and protected. The first cache, buried beneath a distinctive rock formation on the southern shore, yielded 2 waterproof containers filled with original research documents and water samples, the physical proof of contamination that could be independently verified by any reputable laboratory. The second, concealed in a hollow ancient tree deep in the forest's heart, contained hard drives with 15 years of meticulously organized data. Spreadsheets tracking the movement of children through Meridian's network, financial records showing millions of dollars flowing through shell companies to orphanages and medical facilities, internal corporate memos discussing Project Genesis with the casual cruelty of people who saw human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business, and video recordings Thomas had made of executive meetings where these crimes were planned and authorized. The third cache, retrieved from the tide pool during the agent's careful search, held what Rachel Chen called the smoking gun, a complete list of children who had been taken from state institutions for experimental testing, each entry showing a name, a date of birth, an orphanage of origin, and most damning of all, a planned date of recruitment and a subject identification number. Elena's name was there, scheduled for transfer in just 2 weeks from the day she had fled, assigned subject number PG-2847, her entire life reduced to a database entry in a monstrous experiment. The lead FBI agent, a woman named Director Sandra Morrison, who had been building the Meridian case for 3 years, handled each piece of evidence with reverence. Understanding that what Thomas and his family had preserved was not just proof of corporate crime, but documentation of crimes against humanity, a systematic program of child exploitation that had operated for over a decade. She made calls as the evidence was catalogued, her voice crisp with authority as she coordinated simultaneous arrests across multiple states, and the family watched from the main dwelling, wrapped in emergency blankets and drinking hot coffee provided by sympathetic agents, as the conspiracy they had fought so hard to expose finally collapsed like a house of cards. Director Margaret Voss was arrested at Riverside Orphanage within hours of the island being secured, federal agents arriving with warrants and cameras from news organizations that Rachel Chen had alerted, and the footage of Voss being led out in handcuffs, her face, a mask of fury and disbelief, was broadcast nationally before sunset. By the end of that long, extraordinary day, the CEO of Meridian Biotech had been taken into custody along with a dozen senior executives, their offices raided and computers seized, their carefully constructed facade of respectability shattered by the weight of evidence that could not be denied or explained away. The conspiracy that had forced a family into hiding for 15 years, that had stolen the childhoods of countless vulnerable children, that had operated with impunity because its architects believed themselves untouchable, had been brought down by the courage of people who refused to stop fighting, who preserved the truth even when it cost them everything, and who finally found an ally strong enough to help them bring that truth into the light. 3 months had passed since that extraordinary morning when helicopters descended on the island like avenging angels, and the world that Elena now inhabited felt both surreal and more real than anything she had ever experienced. A transformation so complete that sometimes she had to stop and remind herself that this was not a dream from which she would wake to find herself back in the cold dormitory at Riverside. The trials had begun in federal court, and the evidence recovered from the island dominated national headlines day after day, each new revelation more damning than the last. The carefully documented crimes of Meridian Biotech laid bare for the world to see. On this particular morning, Elena sat in the witness box of a federal courtroom in Denver, no longer a frightened runaway in stolen clothes, but a poised young woman in a proper suit that Sarah had helped her choose. Her hair neatly styled, her hands steady as they rested on the polished wood. Behind her, in the first row of the gallery, sat Sarah, Thomas, Grace, and Marcus, a united family whose presence gave her strength as she faced the defense attorneys and the cameras and the weight of public scrutiny. She had already given hours of testimony over the previous days, describing life at Riverside Orphanage, recounting the abuse and the financial irregularities she had discovered, identifying documents and explaining how she had found the map that led her to the island, and her words, delivered with calm clarity, had visibly shaken the courtroom and strengthened the prosecution's case immeasurably. Director Voss, sitting at the defense table in prison clothes, would not meet her eyes, and Elena felt a grim satisfaction in that small victory, in the reversal of power between them. But it was after her testimony concluded, after the prosecution rested its case and the judge called a brief recess, that something extraordinary happened. Something that Rachel Chen had been working behind the scenes to arrange with the help of sympathetic prosecutors and family court judges who understood that justice sometimes required bending normal procedures. The judge, an older man with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness, called Thomas and Sarah forward along with Elena, and he explained that he had received an emergency petition for guardianship, filed by Thomas and Sarah seeking to become Elena's legal guardians and eventually to formally adopt her. The judge acknowledged that the circumstances were highly unusual, that Elena was nearly 18 and the normal process would take months if not years, but he also stated that these were not normal circumstances, that this was a family forged in the crucible of shared trauma and survival, that Elena had found the people who had literally been fighting to save her life before they ever met, and that separating them now would serve no one's interests and would in fact constitute a kind of cruelty. Given Elena's own clearly stated wishes, given the family's obvious love and commitment to her welfare, given the unique circumstances that had brought them together, the judge made a ruling that would be cited in family law journals for years to come. He granted emergency guardianship effective immediately, waived the normal waiting periods, and set a date for formal adoption proceedings in just 60 days. Elena, who had spent 17 years without a family, who had survived on scraps of kindness and learned to expect nothing, who had fled into the night believing she would always be alone, stood in that federal courtroom and heard a judge declare that she was now legally part of a family, that Thomas and Sarah were her guardians, that Grace was her aunt, that Marcus was her brother, that she was no longer an orphan but a daughter, a sister, a granddaughter. And the tears that streamed down her face were not tears of sorrow but of joy so overwhelming she could barely stand. And when Sarah and Thomas embraced her, when the whole family surrounded her in a circle of love and protection, Elena finally understood what it meant to belong. The island, once a prison built from fear and necessity, had been returned to them by the federal government after the trials concluded, the property deed cleared of all legal complications and restored to Thomas's name, and the family faced a choice they had never imagined having: whether to return to the mainland and rebuild normal lives in the world that had tried to destroy them, or to stay on this remote piece of rock that had sheltered them for so long. The decision, when it came, was unanimous and surprisingly easy, because somewhere during 15 years of isolation, the island had stopped being a place of exile and had become home. The first real home any of them had known, and they chose to stay, but this time by choice rather than necessity, as free people rather than fugitives. They rebuilt with purpose and hope, adding new solar panels that could power modern conveniences, installing a satellite internet connection that linked them to the world without requiring them to leave their sanctuary, constructing a proper dock where boats could tie up safely, and transforming the settlement from a desperate hideout into a genuine home. Rachel Chen visited often, taking the ferry to the nearest coastal town and then the boat ride out to the island, and she would sit for hours with the family recording their stories, working on the book that would tell the complete truth about Meridian and Project Genesis and the family that had risked everything to stop them. Marcus taught Elena how to sail using the sturdy new boat they had purchased together with money from the Victim Compensation Fund, and she proved to be a quick learner, her hands growing confident on the tiller, her instincts sharp as she read the wind and the waves. One evening, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and purple and rose, Elena stood on the new dock with Sarah's arm wrapped warmly around her shoulders, watching the light dance across the water that had brought her here 6 months ago, exhausted and terrified and alone. She had fled into the night, searching for freedom, running from a system that wanted to consume her, rowing toward an island that existed only on a stolen map. And she had found something infinitely more precious than simple escape. She had found the family she never knew she had been looking for all along, hidden in the last place the world would ever think to look, waiting for her as if the universe had been conspiring all along to bring them together, and standing there in the golden light with the people who had become her home. Elena finally understood that sometimes the greatest journeys end not where we intended but exactly where we needed to be.